Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I am so excited. I'm over the moon to have the great Jesmyn Ward with us today. I sort of can't believe this is really happening. And I'm tempted to just scrap my entire introduction so I can begin asking the 30 pages of questions that I have for Jesmyn that I have to fit into an hour. But I'm going to quickly go through this introduction. And just so everybody knows, I know you guys have sent in those questions and we're going to get to them at the end. So just be patient. We will get there. But first, here we are on A Thoughtful Bro. We are live every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. We are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube on A Mighty Blaze. A Mighty Blaze, if you don't know, is an all-volunteer initiative that connects writers and readers virtually. We're never asking for money on A Mighty Blaze. If you want to show us the love, you can just follow us on social media, tell your friends about us, like all our videos. But if you are in the mood to spend money, boy, do I have an idea for you. Please spend it on haunting masterpieces by one of our great living writers, Jesmyn Ward. Let Us Descend. Her latest novel is all we're going to be talking about for the next hour. It is an amazing book, a heartrending book, a book of anguish, and ultimately a book of the triumph of the human spirit. We'll get into all of that in a second. If you have questions now, live, just pop them in the comments and we will get to them. A bit more about Jesmyn if you don't know, and this is just a very curtailed bio because her bio is just insane, and she's won like every single award. Jesmyn Ward received her MFA from the University of Michigan and is currently a professor of creative writing at Tulane. She's the author of the novels Where the Line Bleeds and Salvage the Bones, which won the 2011 National Book Award. She went on to write Sing Unburied Sing, which won the 2017 National Book Award. Jesmyn is the only woman and only African American to win the National Book Award for fiction twice. She is the editor of the anthology The Fire This Time and the author of the memoir Men We Reaped, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She received the prestigious MacArthur Fellow Genius Grant in 2017, and in 2022, the U.S. Library of Congress selected Ward as the winner of the library's prize for American fiction at the age of 45. She was the youngest person to ever receive that award for a lifetime of work. And her latest book, Let Us Descend, is out in paperback today. Look at this beautiful paperback. It's out today. It was an Oprah Book Club pick. It was an instant New York Times bestseller. It tells the story of an enslaved girl in the years before the Civil War. It is a story of anguish and grief, but as I said, there's so much hope in this book and where it goes, so much spirituality. It's just an amazing work of literature. It has garnered comparisons to William Faulkner and Toni Morrison. NPR called Let Us Descend angry, beautiful, raw, visceral, and heartfelt. It is the literary equivalent of an open wound from which poetry pours. And Ta-Nehisi Coates said, Jesmyn Ward is, quite simply, the best of us. Jesmyn, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
The honor is all mine. The pleasure is all mine. I was reading this book last week, and I kept saying one thing over and over to myself. I kept saying, how does she do it? How does she do it? That was my reaction. So I guess that's one of the topics of this interview. How do you do it? But, you know, there's another thing they say about books is that each book teaches you to read it, and you have to learn how to read a book from the book itself. And I think the big thing I was learning from this book was slow down, Mark, slow down. Because I mean, you can't eat a Michelin 5-star meal in 9 minutes. And I feel like I got as much as I could from it. I'm just a fast reader, and I just had to keep you can really stop on almost every page and just close the book and say, let me just think about that. So anyway, the book really worked for me. It was a wonderful read. So I guess just to start off the interview, if you could just tell us about, could you just give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of the book?
Okay, so Let Us Descend follows a young woman. Her name is Annis. She's an enslaved woman. I don't ever specify her age in the book, but this isn't giving too much away. So she loses her mother in the beginning of the book, and then she is sold south from the Carolinas and then marched to New Orleans to be sold in the slave pens and the slave markets of New Orleans. So, and you're there with the reader is there with her. The story follows her every step of the way. So it's a story of a descent of a kind, right? But at the same time, there's a bit of magical realism in it because the world that she exists in is one that is populated by different spirits, um, who, I don't know, who are all sort of present in the physical world and can affect the physical world too. So it's not, I guess I say that because I don't want readers who have not yet picked up the book to think, oh, this is just like, like I'm slogging through this terrible reality with this character. It's not that. One thing that I always try to do with any of my books, because I tend to write about topics that are more difficult, I think, for readers to engage with, which is one of the reasons why, as you said, right, like you need to read it sort of slowly. But one of the things that I always attempt to do in all the stories that I tell is to infuse the work with some sense of hope, because I feel like acknowledging hope and infusing the work in some sense of hope reflects the characters' realities. And like when I think about, the people that I come from and the people that I write about, they would not be able to survive and thrive as they do without a sense of hope, right? And so it's always important to me that my work reflects that. And I think that Let Us Descend does reflect that.
I want to talk a little bit more about the spiritual aspect of the book, which was so really worked for me. But it's just interesting that you called it magical realism right at the top here, because to me, and this might be splitting hairs on kind of what literary terms mean, but to me, it didn't seem like magical realism because it just seemed like I thought it was real in a way, right? I mean, I think like when I read like Gabriel Garcia Marquez magical realism, there's a way that it's just so obviously like literary. It's kind of a literary imagination that's going on. But I feel like what Annis was experiencing with these spirits, it seemed like that was her reality, and it didn't seem like something that like the author was doing in a literary tropey way. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think the reason that I use the term magical realism is because I haven't figured out a better term for it yet, right? Like for me, one of the reasons that it was important for these spirits to exist in this world is that I realized pretty early on when I started writing Annis's story that I could not follow her right in this world and write about the reality of her life in this world if there wasn't a spiritual element to it, right? Like if there was nothing beyond the physical world, right? Because that's to me, that's horror. And I couldn't do it. And also I feel like the world that I'm writing about in Let Us Descend, I think that it reflects the kind of world that I grew up in and that I sort of knew in my family. Because I tell these stories about, when I was younger, one of my great grandmothers would always tell us this story about how my great grandfather, he died, and then he came back and he visited her as a ghost, and they had a whole conversation. And one of the things that he told her when he came back and visited her was that he told her to never get married again, which is not great, but she didn't. She never got married again. And then she told us that story for like years, sort of after it happened. And we took it as fact. Like we understood it as fact. Yes, her husband came back to her and he visited her and they had a whole conversation. And then my grandmother was, who I've been writing a lot about lately. My grandmother was born with what the midwives called a caul over her, a veil. She's a veil, which was a caul over her face. And back, in the day, I guess children who were born with the veil would have special powers, right? And it was just a given that that the kids who were lucky enough to be born with the veil would be able to communicate with the spirit world in some fashion, right? And so when I was growing up, my maternal grandmother, she would have prophetic dreams. There were things that she would predict. I mean, she was communicating with the spiritual world in several ways, and we took all of it as a matter of fact. And so I wanted Let Us Descend, I think, to exist in that sort of same kind of reality. Yeah, and in part too, because I think that my enslaved forebears could not have survived what they survived, not only without hope, but also without a sort of spiritual dimension to their lives,
Yeah.
whatever that means.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so clear in the book that Annis would not, I want to give away how that ends, but she would not have been able to go on
Right.
even a fraction of that journey without this kind of communion, if you will. I just want to talk about, like, just take a step back and talk about getting into this material. It is challenging material, writing about slavery, and it's a topic that is so horrific and so huge. It's like writing about the Holocaust, I think. And I think to find a way in and to get the readers to come in, I think you need like an entry point. You need a character, you need a situation. And I would just say, like, for me, one of the most kind of always fresh and revolting things about slavery is the way that white slaveholders would have children by their slaves and then keep those children as slaves and then sell them.
Right.
I mean, like, that just hits every time.
Right.
And I'm just like, it's so, I mean, they didn't even do that in the Holocaust.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's a kind of a perversion that is just uniquely disgusting. And anyway, that is the situation sort of that we start with. But I guess my question to you there is, like, how did you think about, or did you think about that kind of like, if I'm going to take on writing about slavery, like, how am I going to find a way in?
Right. I did think about that, like, it was important to me that, that the main character, that Annis, is like, that she is, I guess, the daughter of a slave owner and an enslaved woman. I think because in part I wanted to sort of highlight that this was done, right? That this is another one of those just horribly sort of inhuman aspects of American chattel slavery. But I think, it's funny, well, it's not funny, but it was interesting to me that when I began writing Let Us Descend, of course I knew I didn't know much about American slavery. Like, I knew next to nothing, right? So I spent 2 years researching and reading about American slavery and American chattel slavery, and just like discovering horrible fact after horrible fact after horrible fact, right? And then trying to figure out how to incorporate all of that into this story in a way that seems organic. But at the same time, like, even as it acknowledges all that horror, which you have to if you're writing about enslaved people, at the same time, it still has to be just a story about a person, right? It still has to be like centered in the person, in the individual, right? And so that's why I think it was really important for me that to tell that story in the first person, from the first person point of view, right? So that Annis is able to tell her story in a way that I think that not many enslaved people have been able to. I mean, we do have slave narratives, right? I think, and some of those slave narratives are, are very honest, I think, about the horrors of slavery, right? But at the same time, they are very much about, like, the individual and them yearning for freedom, and and their memories about their caregivers and what life was like for them when they were younger. And so I really wanted this story to be rooted in Annis's experience, and I wanted her to have particular dreams and desires and loves and hopes for herself. And so that's something that I was thinking about the whole time, and because I wanted to create a kind of balance, right? Um, between like like the horrible things which you have to address, but also the person who's at the heart of that horrible experience.
Yeah. There is a passage from Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates that I always remembered when I read that book when it came out, and it's the one passage that has stuck with me through all this time. And I just want to take a minute and like read this passage because I think it pertains to what you were just saying. So this is from Between the World and Me. Slavery is not an indefinable mass of flesh. Slavery is a particular, specific, enslaved woman whose mind is as active as your own, whose range of feeling is as vast as your own, who prefers the way light falls in one particular patch of the woods, who enjoys fishing where the water eddies in the stream, who loves her mother in her own complicated way, thinks her sister talks too loud, has a favorite cousin, a favorite season. She excels in dressmaking and knows inside herself that she is as intelligent and as capable as anyone. The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemptive history. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine.
Mm-hmm.
Just a passage of surpassing power. And I couldn't help but think of that passage the whole time I was reading this book, because it's like, this is it. It's like, there's millions of people who were slaves, but here is one story to kind of like, you just need one story to actually bring it home what
Right.
it was,
So when I was working on, like I was in the beginning stages of working on Let Us Descend, that is when Ta-Nehisi came out with The Water Dancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a contributing sort of writer for Vanity Fair. And so they asked me to write a profile of him. And so I read that particular, I read all of his books, but I remember reading that particular passage, right? And then I read the advanced copy of The Water Dancer. And this was also, I think, within like a year after Colson Whitehead had come out with Underground Railroad, right? And so I was feeling some sort of like trepidation and nervousness about the fact that, oh God, like now I'm writing a novel about an enslaved person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember like asking Ta-Nehisi in that conversation that I had with him when I was interviewing him for the magazine. And I said, like, should I not do this? I mean, are people, there's a certain weariness, I think, and a certain resistance that people feel towards, narratives about, towards stories about enslaved people, right? And which I totally understand. And so I acknowledged that in my conversation with Ta-Nehisi, and I was like, I don't, should I not work on this? Should I work on something else? And I remember that's one of the things that he said to me. He said, there are millions of enslaved people. So that means there are millions of stories to tell, right? About those people, right? About that experience. And I think, and that was really helpful for me, because I feel like that sort of, having that conversation with him and reading that passage, I think it helped to sort of, it began to help me to change my thinking, I think, around American chattel slavery, around enslaved people, because I realized like I had the same hangups. Like when I was working on like the rough draft of Let Us Descend, it was rough. I was struggling because it was very difficult for me to sink into Annis and to sink into her experience and to sort of sink into her point of view and live with her, because it was very difficult for me to get beyond, or to, I don't know, sort of reach beyond that fact that she had little to no physical agency, right?
Yeah.
It's so alien to how we move through the world that it's just very difficult to sit in that perspective on the page and to create from that perspective. But then, having that conversation with Ta-Nehisi, reading Underground Railroad, which I thought, and also Water Dancer, both of which I thought did really sort of explored those perspectives, right? And made those characters sort of live and breathe as real people, I
Mm.
helped me to begin to sort of unpack the baggage that I had around enslaved people, and also allowed me to, I think, realize that even though as an enslaved person, Annis doesn't have much physical agency, she has all other different types of agency. She has spiritual agency. She has
Yeah.
a sort of imaginative agency. She has an
Mm.
intellectual agency. She has sort of an agency of memory, where she can remember all these stories that her mother told her and her grandmother told her mother, right? That And so she has like all those agencies allow her to sort of transcend her physical
Mhm.
um, restraints in a way. But it took me a while to get to that
Yeah.
understanding.
When you say that, it allowed you to unpack some of your own baggage about slavery, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think I think that it was so hard for me to, I think, like you referenced the Holocaust, right?
Mm.
And I think when we sit with such, you know, with that kind of horror,
Mm.
that it can be difficult to, I don't know, to sort of find our humanity in spite of
Mm.
horror, right? It can be difficult to, I teach creative writing, all right? And so one of the things that I always tell my students is that you find your way to the universal through the particular.
Mm.
So in your writing, you layer your writing with concrete details, concrete imagery, you explore the five senses, right? And and that is what enables you to immerse the reader in a very human, real experience,
Mm.
right? That
Mm.
is very present and that has texture and that seems very real for them, right? And I think that, you know, American child slavery is so horrible, the Holocaust, genocide, right? It's so horrible and it's so unthinkable that I think that often it can be difficult for a writer to to sit in those moments and still find our way to the concrete particular details, right? The rendering
Mhm.
sensory world. It can just be difficult because
Yeah.
your mind is just so, I don't know, broken, I think, by that horror. Um, so yeah, and the only way that I found to sit with that uh, was to just like was to embrace Annis and remember, that Annis is just a person who is trying to live in the midst of very difficult circumstances. So to always just bring it back to Annis, bring it back to what she is observing or feeling or thinking in the world in that moment, and not think about like the enormity of the violent
Mhm.
institution, right, that is shaping
Yeah.
the world around her.
Oh, I mean, there's so much there in what you just said. And so one thing it reminded me of is that I had Phil Cly on the show, and he won the National Book Award for his short story collection Redeployment. And one thing that he was talking about is like, look, it's very difficult to bring war
Mhm.
to the page.
Right.
It's difficult in any circumstance to bring anything to the page, right? But particularly in war, he's like, there's some things that a human being can see
Right.
that you're not even designed as a human being to be able to process.
Right.
Like your body, your brain, your nervous system wasn't even made to understand
Right.
some of the most awful things that a person can see.
Right.
And I was thinking about that a lot as well during this writing. And I think that like what I saw and like what you were just talking about is like the way you sort of always, I could imagine this as like a creative technique of yours, even that like you would just always bring it back to Annis's body.
Mhm.
It was like her immediate sensations, what she's seeing right in front of her, and then that just grounded it every time. And there wasn't a lot of like rhetoric in the book. There wasn't a kind of like a world of ideas other than the mention of Dante, which was very kind of peripheral. It was very interesting, but just very peripheral. What was so impressive about how you handle the material is that it's just her frame of reference, right? I mean, you have a gift, a kind of world-class gift that everybody always talks about, this gift of yours for metaphor and poetic language. But the frame of reference, like when you compare one thing to another, it's always within her extremely limited world of what she sees.
Right. I'm referencing Colson Whitehead a lot, but I served on the panel of judges for the National Book Award year that Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad that it won, and I remember reading that book, and there was a part. I mean, the whole book was phenomenal, right? But there was a scene in that book where the main character, I think her name is Cora, maybe, where she was hiding in an attic. And she was hiding in an attic, and she could look out of this sort of peephole, this window, I think a peephole out of the attic, and she could see these sort of this white supremacist mob basically gathering in a park across from the home that she was hiding in. But the whole time that she was hiding in that attic, as a reader, I felt crowded into that moment, right? And I felt like it just felt very intimate. I felt like I was living it with her, right? Like I felt like, like she's sort of disgusted at her own bodily processes, right? She's sweating, she's hot, she's uncomfortable, right? She's like, I don't know, she's crammed into her, into her body, surrounded by all these physical sensations, right? Which does the same for you as a reader. You feel like you're living this moment sort of with her and really feeling with her and for her at the same time, because you're being crowded into this very visceral moment. And I remember, like, after I read that particular scene or passage, I had a section I stopped, and I thought, that was amazing. I've never read anything centered in an enslaved in an enslaved person's sort of point of view that made me feel so close to them, right? That made me feel like their fear and their discomfort and their longing, and just that did all the things that you want literature to do for you, like when you're reading. And I thought, I want to do that. Right? Like, I want to write Annis's story, and I want to do that. And so I again, like, I used, especially the brilliance of that particular passage and experience, I think, as a model for me as I was writing Lettuce to Sin. And I just kept sort of, I don't know, using it as a reminder of what I wanted to accomplish on the page.
So I want to switch gears to Annis as a character and how you told the story, because I think the story, as powerful as the story is, and Annis's situation and the hell that she goes through, I actually think there's like another interesting question, just to take it to a kind of craft perspective of how to tell a story. So as a central thing of any story is that, like, a person needs to have agency. Like, they need to want something and be trying to do something. That's sort of, and it's debatable, but like, you could say, like, this is an important aspect to any story. Well, when somebody is sort of, like, by definition, like, the central fact of her life, the governing fact is you have no agency. You are a slave. Right. So then how do you tell a story about somebody who has no power? And I think, so what's so incredible about the story is the ways that she finds agency within that. And as you said, it's emotional agency, imaginative agency, agency of the intellect, of will. But I just kind of, you said once in an interview, you said, to wake up, to breathe, to stand up, to choose to live, these are acts of resistance against hopelessness. Living requires hope. So I just kind of wanted to put that back to you about, the agency that she has and kind of how that created a story for her, kind of like discovering new levels of her own agency.
Right. And so when I began writing Let Us Descend, I didn't know any of that. I mean, I feel like for me, writing a rough draft, especially, is a journey of discovery, where I don't begin a book and know the story. I discover the story basically as I write my way into a world and into a character. And I think, that as Annis begins to figure out, right, like, um, through everything that she sort of lives, right, in the novel, as she begins to figure out that that waking up is an act of resistance, that, you know, standing up is an act of resistance, that uh, pacing herself in certain ways in the work that she was forced to do is an act of resistance, in choosing to even continue, right, to live
Mm.
is an act of resistance instead of succumbing to despair and choosing not to live, right? Like I think I discovered that at the same time that the character discovered that, as she makes her way through the world. And I at the time that I was like writing, completing the rough draft and doing all of the revision, I was sort of living through my own dark moment where I was like struggling with grief.
Mm.
And so in a way, writing I feel like it was meant for me to write Annis's story when I did, because her journey and her coming to that eventual sort of realization, right? I think that led me to the same, it was like we took that journey together,
Hmm.
and it led me, I think, to that same realization, right?
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. So I mean, in a way, like, I guess in a way, I saved her, but I also think that she saved me.
Yeah. I love stories about the spirit, and I myself am a very spiritual person. The book that I published this year is about a relationship with the spiritual. It's very different than your book in many ways, but it does, the central thing is about a kind of discovery of a character who's in hardship and discovers a relationship with the divine or the spiritual world. These are stories that are very meaningful to me, and that's why when I made that point earlier about magical realism, but that could just be like my personal taste. It's like magical realism just seems more real to me. Like that's just kind of my reality is just more magical on a basic level. But yeah, I mean, one thing that really struck me also about her spirituality is that it wasn't God per se. It wasn't Jesus. It was very unique to her and her ancestors. And this is something that you've written about in your other work as well. There's a kind of the importance and kind of like the true existential absolute importance of like being in touch with those who have come before. And I think one of the most kind of powerful messages of the book to me is how the book seems to be saying, like, if it's important to remember what our ancestors lived and went through, and sort of if they went through this, then I can draw strength from that. Because it's like, so you were saying at the top of the show, like, I don't want people to think like it's just all like terrible hardship and everything. There's a lot of that, but I think one of the reasons why it's not just that is that I think, like I said, the message of the book is like, if you witness this and you think about this, it will give you strength yourself to take steps forward.
Right. Right. I mean, I, as I get older, I feel like as I just sort of grow as a person and grow as a writer, I find myself thinking about, thinking about the people who came before me, thinking about my parents and their lives and my grandparents and my great grandparents and beyond, right? And and just sort of I think marveling at sort of at the, I guess the, how different their realities were. But then also, I don't know, sort of coming to new understandings of how, how there were many elements in their existence that in their lives that was like that mirror mine, and that are are the same.
Mhm.
And I think that they too drew hope from the people that came before them.
Mhm.
They too, I think one of the most interesting things for me to sort of realize in the past, I don't know, 3 4 years, um, was that like was the importance of storytelling
Mm.
in my family, right? And
Mm.
to those who, in my mom's generation and my grandparents' generation, right? Like I would think about when I was a kid. And so my maternal grandmother, she came from a really big family, right? Lots of siblings. I don't know, she might have had like 11, 12. I mean, she had a lot of siblings, right? And when I was growing up, we lived with my grandmother for a lot of years, but my extended family was really close. We would gather a lot. We would, my grandmother would host these parties at her house. And a lot of, when I think back to it, like a lot of those parties, like it wasn't just all, I don't know, music and eating. There was a lot of storytelling
Mm.
that was happening, right?
Yeah.
Where my grandmother was telling stories about, about her mom and her dad and then her grandparents. And these were, uh, like you sort of funny stories, very rooted in the physical world. And then she's telling us, I don't know, it's like stories about prophetic dreams that she had about this person or that person, or stories about, I don't know, this person, you know having some sort of like spiritual experience. So I don't know. So I think that because I've been sort of thinking about all those things, right? That maybe that's why, that that kind of like textured reality, right? Multi-layered reality, right?
Mm.
Um, that sort of uh, recognition of like storytelling as a tool of survival. Like I
Yeah.
think that that's maybe a reason that all of those sort of thematic concerns like showed up in Let Us Descend. I think because I've been, I don't know, coming to those realizations in my
Yeah.
life when I think about my family.
I want to talk about the title of the book for a second. There was a question earlier in the chat. Somebody was asking like how you come up with the title, and I read something about you that you think you're terrible at titles. But I think when gifted people think they're terrible at something, that's always like the thing that they end up being best at, because they try so hard to overcome this perceived weakness. But
Right.
but you said an amazing thing about titles, which I like totally want to bring in titling my own books, that you like an active verb in the
Mhm.
title, like sing, unburied sing, and let us descend, and so on. But so let us descend is a line from the Inferno and Dante, and it's a line that Virgil, who leads Dante into the underworld, says, let us descend kind of into the underworld. And it's something that Annis becomes aware of through a teacher of hers. And so her book is kind of, she occasionally references Dante and on her own hellish journey. So I wanted to kind of ask you about why you included that. But I also just wanted to say that, like, when you're talking about storytelling, it made me think of the title, because one level on which I took that title is like, it's Let Us Descend. And it's not just let us descend into hell in the story, but it's like, to me, it hit as like, let us descend into storytelling itself.
Mhm.
Because like, to me, that's one of the beautiful things about books, that books do that like almost nothing else can do. It's like, you can't just talk about some things, even like on a show like this, or like, at a party. You just can't just up and like, let's talk about this deep experience of slavery. You need to go through many levels before you're like spiritually in the place
Mhm.
to take in the story. So I just wanted to say that was like another level that I took the title on.
Mhm. Yeah, I do say that I'm bad at titling books because anything really, because titles don't just come to me. Like I
Mm.
have to generate lists of titles. I'm pretty sure that at least like 75% of the titles that I generate are really bad. And then I choose the best one out of the list. But I mean, I'll have, a page and a half just worth of titles, like
Mhm.
so you know, I so it is something that I work at. I think Let Us Descend rose to the top sort of pretty quickly, which as you confirmed, right, that I got it from the Inferno. And I, the reason that I chose that title in part was because I I've done a lot of driving because I suffer from a fear of flying, and so when I was in California, when I was in Michigan in my, 20s and into my 30s, like instead of flying, I would drive, right? I've
Mhm.
done a lot of driving like through the Southeast too, right? And so one of the things that I was thinking about, when I was thinking about Anna's taking this walk, right, or this forced march, right, is the fact that geographically that she would be descending, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and so I was already thinking about her journey in terms of a descent, right? In terms of like going down to New Orleans, where New Orleans is like at sea level, right? And and then too, I I I I feel like I think because of my experience with Salvage the Bones, where my protagonist in Salvage the Bones, Esh, is, she's reading Edith Hamilton's mythology. She's talking about Greek myths.
Mhm.
She's using those Greek myths to attempt to understand her own experience and what she's going through.
Mhm.
And so it was sort of sad, I think, to me when people would remark upon it and sometimes would, I don't know, have sort of a more negative reaction
Mhm.
to her using those Greek myths to understand her life. Uh, because I just felt like, why not? Right?
Mm.
Because she's a poor Black girl doesn't mean that she shouldn't have access to Greek mythology or to literature outside of her experience, right? That she can then use to understand her life. I don't know. It bugged me, and so I think that I was thinking about that when I began to think about Annis and who Annis is, and I thought, well, so this is a young woman who she can't read
Yeah.
by law. She can't read, um, uh, but that doesn't mean that she's not hungry for reference outside of her experience to try to help her understand her life, right? And so I think that it's great that she has, right, this sort of this oral storytelling sort of tradition, right, that from her grandmother to her mother and then to her, right, that she has these to draw on, those stories, those histories to draw on. But I wanted her to have something even further afield,
Yes.
right? And so I'm like, so she has half sisters, right? They're being educated at this house. Why can't she steal some of that education for herself?
Mhm.
Right? Like, why can't she can listen through walls. She can
Yeah.
hear these stories as well and then use them to try to navigate what she's going through. Like we all do. That's what we do, I feel like, with stories and with literature,
No,
right?
I mean, like, so Dante is,
Experience.
she knows a little bit about Dante, and it does mean something to her, and it's like a piece of this kind of storytelling world that helps her in her way. But it's like, look, Annis's experience is very different from my experience,
Right,
right? I'm taking something from Annis.
right,
I'm learning from Annis, and so like, and Annis and me couldn't be more different in many
right,
ways. But
right,
it's like she takes from Dante, I take from Annis, like,
right,
this is why we do this,
right,
right?
right. Correct.
So, all right. So I'm going to do a few more questions. We're going to shift gears and like talk about craft and writing. There's a lot of people who listen to this show who are writers, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. But so I do something. This is a little bit cheeky and shallow, I know, but like I do something called the 2-minute MFA on the show. Whenever I have somebody who teaches creative writing,
Yes.
and so I will tell you, I don't want to put the pressure on you, but like I've gotten like some of the most interesting bits of writing advice in my life from this very exercise. But 2-minute MFA is just, okay, Jesmyn, you teach at Tulane, you have students come through all the time, and you certainly probably share all kinds of writing advice with them, but I'm just wondering, could you share with us, who will never have the chance to have you as a writing teacher, like give us like maybe one piece of writing advice that you feel like is ideally A, like really, really, really important, and B, something that maybe is like particular to you, that like you emphasize and maybe other writing teachers don't as much?
I think two things. Okay. The first thing is that I think that the kind of writing that I love and the kind of writing that I attempt to do every time, that I'm on the page is writing, like I said earlier, that's like very rooted in concrete sensory details, right? Because I want to immerse the reader in an experience, right? With whatever character, we're with in the story. It's also important to me that, and I think this is something that I emphasize in class and that I do in my own work, it's also important to me that the particular sensory details that you use, right? That the things that the character notices, the connections that the characters make, the metaphors that they use, the simile that they use, that all that is rooted in place, in their experience and who they are and what they've seen in their lives and what they've been through, right? And so that is something that I encourage my students to think about and that I think about in my own work in every step of the process, from writing rough draft to, the 15 revisions that come after that to the final version, right, of whatever the work is. You have to think about all those the larger craft issues at different places, I think, along that process, right? So, like in the first revision, you're probably thinking about, structure and balance between narration and scene. And right, you're thinking about sort of larger character development, right? And then, later on, you're sort of in the later revisions, you're cleaning up language issues, right? Or pacing, right? But that, like the concrete details, the concrete imagery, figurative language, like that's something that I think about in every part of the process. That I think is probably, that is very, I think, particular to me. The second thing is that, and I always tell my students this at the end of the semester, and whenever anyone asks me, sort of a writing advice, general question about like writing advice, this is the one that I'd love to share, because it has been very important to me, I think, in my life and in my writing life, in my career. Because this industry is what it is, you will be rejected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of
times.
And hearing that you will be rejected hundreds of times is different from actually being rejected hundreds of times, right? I think we all fear that we will be.
It's an important distinction. You gotta live it,
right? But then actually living it, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
You want to give up very quickly, right?
Yeah.
You want to silence yourself. You want to take yourself out of. You want to give up very quickly, right? You want to bow out of the writing life very quickly, and so I always want to say this to writers, beginning writers. I want to tell them that, and then I also want to tell them that you will be rejected hundreds of times, right? But you only need one person to say yes to you, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of people can tell you no. Thousands of people can tell you no. Your job is to do the work on the page and to do
Mm.
the work to like grow as a writer and to create the best work that you can, so that and to continue to put yourself out there again and again and again, so that you can eventually find that one person that is going to tell you yes, and that
Yes.
will open a door for you. And then that open door will lead to another person who will tell you yes, and who will
Mm.
open another door for you. And that is
Mhm.
how you make a career of this, right? That is how you tell the stories that you build the kind of create the kind of life that you want, where you're telling the stories that you want to tell, right? Is by, sort of fighting your way through all the no's or
Yeah.
swimming through all the no's to find your way to the yes, and then another yes further down the line, and then another yes. And you do this for
Yeah.
years, right? I mean, just because I think something that people think when they see me or when they hear about my career, I have had a lot of successes, right?
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that I still don't, people still tell me no all the time, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
The sort of negative feedback does not end, right?
Yeah.
And so, you'd have to sort of root yourself in the work and do the work and know that, that the negative feedback, I mean, it is an element of this industry and of the work that we do.
Yeah.
Um, and you just have to learn how to weather it and find your way to the positive feedback and the yeses.
I was like listening to this commencement speech that Roger Federer gave
Mhm,
like a few months ago, and
mhm.
he was talking about how like he thinks talent needs to be redefined, because he's
Mm,
like the way talent is defined normally is like a particular gift or skill that's like sort of almost mystical, like your gift for language and his gift for a forehand, and the gift. And he's like, but what if like you think the ability to pick yourself up after you fall down is a talent?
right,
What if like a person can have a talent for like willpower or determination,
right,
and it's like, and actually what it takes is a bunch of different talents, and like
right,
the talent for like the actual thing is
right.
just one of many talents
Yep,
that you need,
yep. Yeah, yeah. You need the talent of being able to pick yourself up, the talent to keep going, the talent of developing a sense of discipline about
yeah,
what you do.
yeah,
I think that one's really important and something that maybe we don't talk about
yeah,
enough.
yeah. All right, one more question from me, then we'll take a couple from the audience. You have described writing as being magical,
Mhm.
and you were first drawn to writing, and you thought it was a magical thing, and you thought I could never do that, and then you start to do it, and it seems to be like obviously this is a life calling for you to like participate in this great magic making of which is writing. But I just wanted to ask you, like, what is it? What is the magical aspect of writing? What is the magic thing that writing does?
I think it allows the reader to, and we talked a little bit about this before, I feel like, but it allows the reader to live an experience in a way that no other form does.
Mm,
I mean, I think that is one of the sort of aspects of reading that hooked me very early on when I was a kid. Here I was, this like poor kid from rural Mississippi, right, who only had access to the books in my school library. Yet I was able to pick up The Secret Garden, right, and be transported to a totally different place, totally different experience, and live a life that was totally outside of outside of my realm of experience. And then I was able to do that again with Harriet the Spy, and again with, from the mix of files of Mrs. Bosley Frank Wheeler, and again with The Hero and the Crown, right, which I was able to move into this a fantasy reality. And so therein lies the magic for
mhm,
me, and like inhabiting an entirely different world and more importantly, an entirely different sort of experience with a person that you not only feel for, but feel with, right? I mean, I think I was a crier very early on when I read books. I can't remember the first book that made me cry. I remember sort of being taken aback by like the strength of the emotion, right? The fact that I was crying because of this thing that I'm reading, but that I think that's a testament to that magic, right? That it was so complete. That I felt it so completely that it moved me to tears.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. So we have a few minutes left. Let's pop some questions up on the screen here. All right. Anne Marie Booth, tell us about your writing process. Where do you start? Do you know the ending before you start, as does Ann Patchett?
I do not know that. I say this a lot. I often wish that I were a different type of writer, because I, sort of think about other people's processes enviously. And I think, oh, how great would it be to have a complete outline, to know exactly what will happen next, what will happen in each chapter, to know exactly where you're going to end the book. I attempted to write from an outline with my first novel, and I got 3 chapters in to the novel, to the rough draft of the novel, and I just threw the outline away. Because the world that I thought that I was writing about, and the characters I thought that I was writing about at the beginning of the novel, even 3 chapters in, I realized these are totally different people, and this is a totally different world from what I thought it was, right?
Yeah.
So the outline was useless. So no, I never know the end. I might have like a vague idea of what the characters might encounter towards the end of the book, right? So like with Salvage the Bones, I knew that I knew that Hurricane Katrina was coming. But that's not the end. That's not the end. That's not the entirety of the end. So many other things, sort of happen. I don't know. The end consists of so many other things.
Yeah.
So I don't know the ending. I begin each project with a general idea of who, like, the 2 or 3 main characters are, and then maybe I don't know, a general idea about where they're going. So in Salvage the Bones, I knew that the hurricane was coming. In Sing and Buried Sing, I knew they were going on a road trip. I didn't know anything else, and I just sort of write my way into it.
Great. Okay, let's take maybe 1 or 2 more.
Okay.
Almost out of time here. Jesmyn, how do you feel when you found out? How did you feel when you found out your book was an Oprah pick? Wait, did that only happen once, or is it twice? Is it just once?
Only once.
Only once. Okay.
Yeah, and it's something, of course, right? Like, I mean, I, sort of committed to writing in the early 2000s, around 2003. And, that back then, right? Like the Oprah Book Club was the thing, right? I mean, if you were picked for the Oprah Book Club back in the early 2000s, it was incredible, right? Your audience, you suddenly had millions of people, reading your work, responding to your work. I mean, it was an amazing, transformative thing, and it still is, right? And I had been sort of dreaming of it for so long. So that when it finally happened, it was amazing and totally overwhelming. And when on the day that the book that Let Us Descend launched, I visited Oprah's offices in Manhattan, right? And I walked into the main door for the offices, and I don't know, I hope it's okay for me to say this, but all the people there stood up and they all started clapping.
Oh.
And I just started crying. So overwhelming and so
Yeah.
surreal, and I felt so grateful,
Mm.
and moved. So I don't. It's been a dream.
Oh, amazing. All right, let's do one last question from the audience. What are you reading right now, or what book have you read recently that you would recommend?
So my reading is a little strange right now because I'm attempting to read middle grade YA books because I'm attempting to write a middle
Hmm.
grade YA book, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing, what I should
Hmm.
be doing, and so one of the most recent books that I read that sticks with me, that I love, um, love to the point that I'm a little jealous and I wish that I had written it, is this book called Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark. And it's phenomenal. It's a middle grade, or not, I don't know, it's probably YA, and there are all these fantastical elements in it. Um, and I don't know, the characters are just so alive and so vivid, and it's also very clever, but not clever in like a self-conscious, showy way, just like authentically clever. I don't know, but I love it. It's really good. So if you find yourself wanting to read, some great YA, then pick up Ring Shout.
Good shout out. Okay, we'll put that in the chat. And then, so is this the next book we're going to see from Jesmyn Ward? Is this middle
Well,
grade book?
next year, I think, because let's see, the schedule has changed because I'm a little late on delivery. I think the next book that you'll see from me next year, I think, is an essay collection, which I've never done an essay collection before, but I've written lots of narrative nonfiction, I guess. And so this is just a collection of most of the narrative nonfiction that I've written, and I've written about, I've written about Hurricane Katrina. I've written about, I wrote about, one of my more recent pieces, the Vanity Fair essay that I wrote about the death of my partner
Oh, yeah.
in 2020, and the protests, right? The George Floyd protests. So it's just a collection of my essays that's coming out next year. And then after that, hopefully that's when the middle grade YA book will come out. Hopefully a few years after. Give me to 2027. Hopefully I'm praying that.
Fine. But I love your essays, though. I read a ton of your essays before this interview, and oh god, I love them so much. So I'm psyched for that. Will there be any like original material in that, or it's just all?
There will. There are a couple of essays that will be included in that actually haven't been published.
Okay. Right on. All right, folks. So the book is Let Us Descend. It's brilliant. It's amazing. I hope you love this interview. I have one last question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, Jesmyn, which is that imagine, if you will, the ideal reader for Let Us Descend. Somebody who's just getting the book the way that you hoped it would be gotten in your wildest dreams. And so imagine this ideal reader finishes the book. It's sitting in their lap. They look out the window. And just tell us in, like, if you can, a phrase or even just a single word. Like, what is that reader feeling?
Okay, I'm going to tell you a true story.
This is good.
And, every time I think about it, it makes me feel deeply honored and deeply and humbled, I think, in a way. So my editor is friends with someone who's, I think, parent, maybe an older gentleman. I think he is, I want to say he's in his 80s, and he read Let Us Descend, and he told I think his, child who passed this along to my editor. He said, I am glad that I lived long enough to read this book. Right. Every time I think about it, it's hard for me to believe that someone actually said that, about something that I created. I mean, it just leaves you speechless. Like, what do you say to that? I don't know.
I'm like all choked up now.
Right. And so, and I
Yeah.
think about it sometimes, and so, I don't know. I'm just, like I said, deeply honored and humbled and committed to still doing the work.
Mm. That was beautiful. My goodness. All right. What a place to end. Jesmyn, thank you so much. This is the day your paperback comes out. I am so honored that you took a few minutes to be here on our show. Thank you, everyone in the audience who was there. Thank you for your questions. Sorry I didn't get to everybody. Check this out. This will drop on the podcast in a couple days. Jesmyn, thank you so much. Best of luck on your book tour, and looking forward to any and all books coming in 2027 or in 2037. Anytime. We're here. Okay. Bye, everybody. And thanks again, Jesmyn.